What Prop 209 did was to add a paragraph to our state constitution prohibiting the use of affirmative action techniques, race-conscious, gender-conscious affirmative action techniques in public education, public employment, and public contracting. Perhaps most notoriously, the immediate impact of Proposition 209 was a dramatic drop in the number of African American and Latino students at our University of California campuses. Perhaps most notoriously, the University of California at Berkeley Law School ended up with only one African American student in the first class selected after Proposition 209, and that individual had actually been admitted previously and deferred his enrollment. But today, 24 years later, we continue to see the impacts of Proposition 209. I'll give you just one statistic. Today in California, African American and Latino students make up 60% of 12th graders in our public schools statewide. 60% of those who are high school seniors and on the cusp of going on to higher education. And yet, at our University of California system-wide, African Americans and Latinos make up only 29% of undergraduates. 60% of 12th graders, only 29% of UC undergraduates at all campuses. That's a measure of the dramatic disparities that we continue to see in the state of California and that we are not able to address aggressively because of Proposition 209. But I do want to highlight what else has changed in 24 years. First, the demographics of our voters have changed. So those supermajorities in opposition to Proposition 209 among African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, if those percentages applied today, the outcome would have been different. Because today, voters of color comprise 42 to 43% of all registered voters in the state of California. That's substantially higher than it was in 1996. So such a racially divisive measure would not have the same outcome as we saw 24 years ago. But something else has changed in 24 years, and that is our United States Supreme Court has weighed in on a number of occasions about race-conscious, gender-conscious affirmative action programs in public education, public employment, and public contracting. Specifically, in the ensuing 24 years since 1996, the U.S. Supreme Court has addressed affirmative action in higher education twice in the University of Michigan cases, Gratz and Grutter, and after that, twice more in the same case of Fisher versus University of Texas. In the area of employment, in the Ricci case versus City of New Haven, in 2009, the U.S. Supreme Court has addressed affirmative action in employment. The upshot of all of this is that the U.S. Supreme Court has become much more descriptive about what is permitted and what is required in pursuing affirmative action. First of all, even before Prop 209, we know that the U.S. Supreme Court has prohibited anyone from using quotas or set-asides based on race or gender in any of these public realms. Since 1978, a case called Bakke versus University of California, out of Davis Medical School, the U.S. Supreme Court has made clear that we cannot anywhere in this country employ quotas or set-asides based on race or gender. But more recently, in the cases I've described, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it clear that any public policy-making entity interested in using affirmative action must first go through a rigorous analysis and consideration of policy changes before it may put in place a narrowly tailored program to consider race or gender. The U.S. Supreme Court has considerably narrowed the circumstances under which anyone can employ race or gender conscious affirmative action. And those restrictions would apply in the state of California even after Proposition 16 is enacted. What is required is a rigorous examination of disparities like the percentages that I described between 12th graders and UC undergrads. Anybody interested in implementing affirmative action must look carefully at those disparities, identify the causes of those disparities, and consider whether there are race-neutral and gender-neutral approaches to addressing those disparities before an entity can consider a race or gender-conscious affirmative action program. What that means is that some of the most important progress from Prop 16 may well be in the form of changes that are race-neutral or gender-neutral that result from that rigorous analysis and policy consideration mandatory in California by the US Supreme Court. So, for example, we might see race-neutral, gender-neutral changes in admissions criteria with positive effects for all races and genders created as a result of Proposition 16. The problem you see is that Proposition 209 has prevented the University of California and other public entities from engaging in the rigorous analysis and policy consideration required by the US Supreme Court, because in the end of implementing affirmative action, and as we all know, no politician wants to highlight an issue like racial or gender disparities if they then are prevented from putting a solution in place. So because Proposition 209 has prevented us from considering any affirmative action program, our policymakers have simply not engaged in that rigorous analysis of racial and gender disparities, engage in that careful consideration of policy approaches, including race and gender neutral approaches to addressing those disparities. We have basically been prevented in this state from engaging in that kind of careful consideration of what we all now see as a result of the pandemic, the recession, and the Black Lives Matter movement. It's for this reason that we believe that opportunity for all Californians will be promoted by the passage of Proposition 16. It will enable all of our policymakers to engage. Indeed, it will put great pressure on our policymakers to engage in that rigorous analysis and careful consideration that the US Supreme Court has described. Proposition 209 also affected what kindergarten through 12th grade school systems can do. And I will give you an example of where it was nearly an impediment to an important policy reform that was implemented. The local control funding formula that provides additional resources to schools based on the number of foster youth, youth from low socioeconomic circumstances, and English learners was actually delayed because there were legislators who were concerned that LCFF, the local control funding formula, would violate Proposition 209. And that is because English learner category, for example, overlaps very heavily with Latino and Asian American students with racial categories. So foster youth overlaps very heavily with African American students. So the legislature was concerned that it would be viewed, although it is a race-neutral solution because it focuses not on race, but on low SES, foster youth status, and English learner status. It is race-neutral and therefore permissible, but they paused and even sought outside legal advice to assure them that they could engage in that kind of step in K-12 public education. Second, I understand that folks who have relied on a particular set of criteria for admission for a long time have concerns. That's why I emphasized how carefully the approach to affirmative action must be under US Supreme Court precedent. And the state of California cannot get out of those requirements. This is a very careful and rigorous assessment before changing criteria. But there are clearly criteria that have a discriminatory effect, and that effect is within all races and genders. because we do have a leader in the White House who has built his entire administration around sowing greater division, around encouraging people to see themselves as part of subgroups. And then he clearly indicates who he thinks of those subgroups should be on top first, and those implicitly who are left behind. But I think what we see, particularly in the last 6 months in the reaction to the police murder of George Floyd, as we had seen on video many police murders previously. But I think we've seen a far more vigorous response following George Floyd's murder and the subsequent events. And I think that demonstrates a hunger to react to what is being created by Donald Trump, and a hunger to have greater unity around eliminating discrimination. And the other thing that I will say is discrimination has costs for all of us. The only way, economic costs, that's been documented. If you don't address inequities, your ability to grow the pie for everyone is severely limited. So the way to get out of zero sum is actually to embrace equal opportunity for all, because that's the only way we're going to expand the pie for everyone and eliminate the notion that this is zero sum.
One of the ways our communities get the bad impacts of systemic racism is we don't have sufficient political power. We have the numbers, but we don't have money to contribute to campaigns, to have lobbyists, and so we do not get our interests adequately taken care of by the political system. This is part of systemic racism. Proposition 16 helps in very concrete ways. I really hear the concerns of the Asian American community, but Proposition 209 did not increase the numbers of Asian Americans getting into higher education. I actually think that the people who pushed Proposition 209 were terrified at the increasing numbers of Latinos in California. And the notion that there would have to be parity and equality, I think, scared them to death. And I think this was one of the motivating factors behind Proposition 209. I also think they played on prejudice about African Americans. I think a lot of what was behind Proposition 209 were negative stereotypes about African Americans. We're lazy, we're dumb, we shouldn't be able to get into these schools of higher education, so stop this affirmative action. So let me talk somewhat about the results of Proposition 209. Tom talked about my alma mater, Berkeley Law School. When I entered Berkeley Law in 1972, there were 30 Black students in my class. As Tom pointed out, the year after affirmative action came into effect, there was only one student, Eric Brooks. Imagine the ripple effect of having 29 fewer African Americans getting that high caliber legal education at UC Berkeley. Let me talk about the educational piece. The State Personnel Board tried to make sure that there was not discrimination against women and people of color. And they instituted a program that would have qualified people of color and women employed. That was struck down by the courts because of Proposition 209. That resulted in a whole bunch of qualified women and people of color who didn't get good government jobs. Dr. Shirley Weber was the author of what became Proposition 16. In San Diego, she tried to institute a STEM program for girls: science, technology, engineering, and math. That program had to be discontinued because of Proposition 209. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Hidden Figures about the Black women who helped get people into space. That went on when I was in high school. I knew nothing about that. I was a little nerd and did well in chemistry. I might well be an astrophysicist today and not talking to you about Proposition 16 had there been programs focused for girls and African Americans that showed the broad array of possibilities for us. The last thing I'll say about Proposition 209 is the following, and this is of dire concern to all communities. As a result of Proposition 209, businesses owned by women and people of color have lost $1 billion a year. Asian American, Latino, Native American, African American, and women-owned firms lost $1 billion a year, and that is a lowball estimate. Imagine what would have happened in our communities had that money from our tax dollars that we pay gone into our pockets. We tend to hire our own people, so just imagine the ripple effects. That is a concrete problem that flows from Proposition 209. So Proposition 16 is going to be on the ballot on November 3rd. Pilar, you raised something that's very relevant. There is great confusion about what Proposition 16 means. And if you just read the language, you go, no, I don't think so. I have sat in on focus groups with African Americans. They are read the language of the initiative. There are, I think, 12 people in the focus group I saw in Southern California. They all went, no, I'm not voting for that. After 10 minutes of explaining that it restores affirmative action, it's connected to the dismantling of systemic racism, I think almost all of them said, oh yes, I'm definitely voting for this. They were even saying that we should talk about white supremacy in our advertising. I went, I don't think that's going to play with the larger public. But that goes to how deeply Black Americans and other Americans know that affirmative action is part of the solution. What affirmative action based on gender and race does is it looks at the totality of African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans or women or Native Americans and brings us all along. But empirical work has been done to demonstrate that class-based affirmative action or affirmative action based on poverty does not desegregate based on race.
That in order to change the status quo that disproportionately disadvantages many communities, you had to take action, you had to be proactive, and that simply putting your head in the sand around issues of race and gender or immigrant rights would not actually create the type of positive progress that we would like to see. I think this issue is especially important for Asian Americans right now. In the COVID pandemic, we've seen the Asian American community be disproportionately harmed, not only in terms of health impacts, but also in terms of a rise of anti-Asian hate. At CAA, we've helped document more than 2,500 reports of hate incidents that have happened since the president started using rhetoric like the China virus or Kung flu. And yesterday, many of you know, Congresswoman Grace Meng introduced a resolution against this anti-Asian hate. I think it's worth noting that 164 Republicans voted against that resolution that was to condemn anti-Asian hate. And I would speculate that, in fact, all of those members are also against affirmative action. And the Republican Party is one of the most visible opponents to Prop 16 right now. I think in the Asian American community, there's been lots of focus on the issue of affirmative action, specifically in the realm of college admissions. So I want to talk about that. But before I do, I want to point out that Prop 16 is actually much, much larger. Prop 16, first of all, as the other speakers have noted, addresses public contracting. And research shows that Asian American businesses earn more in public contracting dollars in states and cities where affirmative action is legal than they do in California. Cities like Chicago and Atlanta, our research shows Asian American contractors do much better than they do in San Francisco, despite having many more Asian American contractors, government contractors in San Francisco. Now, it's not just businesses that want to do business with government. It also affects all small businesses. And we know during the COVID pandemic that Asian-owned small businesses have been harmed even before the shelter-in-place policies due to the rise in racism. That includes our restaurants, that includes our retail, that includes our nail salons. But many of these small businesses have not been able to access some of the federal support programs. Something like 90% of small businesses owned by women and people of color were shut out of the Paycheck Protection Program, one of the primary ways the federal government sought to support small businesses. With something like Prop 16, you could have more narrowly tailored, targeted programs to make sure that these businesses actually are able to access the support that they're entitled to. It's one of the reasons why groups like the California Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce has endorsed Proposition 16. Proposition 16 is also not just about public contracting, it's also about public employment. One of the largest parts of our public sector workforce is our K through 12 teacher workforce. And right now, over 67,000 Asian American students will go to school where there are 0 Asian American teachers. In the area of wages, Asian American women earn 75 cents on the dollar paid to white men. And many of us know that Asian Americans, despite doing well, perhaps educationally, face a whole host of glass ceilings or bamboo ceilings where they're not represented in leadership, they're not represented in management. And the role of public education, I think it's worth pointing out that we oftentimes see a conflation between two different issues. On the one hand, affirmative action, and on the other hand, higher education scarcity and discrimination against Asian Americans. We know that Asian Americans face discrimination in all sectors, including in higher education. But the solution to that discrimination is not to ban affirmative action, it's actually to have more effective race-conscious programs like affirmative action. For example, diversity of admissions officers, better cultural competency training, making sure we're addressing implicit bias, ensuring that there's rigorous oversight. Simply saying that, Asian Americans face discrimination in higher education, and so let's all just stick in our head in the sand against the discrimination that affects all communities of color is simply not the solution. And the reality is that most Asian Americans understand this. Earlier this week, there was a report out from AAPI data that showed 70% of Asian Americans do support affirmative action. It's also worth pointing out that the Asian American community is very, very diverse. In California, the largest Asian American subgroup is the Filipino community. And so I think when you start to sort of dig in and when you have the chance to explain how Proposition 16 works, we actually see support in the Asian American community, including in the Chinese American community. But it's important to represent the facts accurately. For example, one of the big fears is around quotas. And as Tom mentioned before, quotas are illegal across the country. They cannot come back. The Supreme Court has been really clear about that. The other language we sometimes hear is around race-based admissions. The Supreme Court has also been really clear that if race is to be considered, it could only be considered of one of many factors. In the University of California, it would be something like the 15th or 16th factor. And it could not be the primary factor. It could not be the determinant factor. So I think these are some of the mistruths that are out there that we have to help the community understand, that there could not be quotas, that race would be just one of many factors, and to remember that we actually push for affirmative action for Asian Americans in many settings. We think it's absolutely critical that the immigrant community has all the real information and facts and are not fooled by the opposition and their leadership, mostly Trump supporters. And I'll give you just one example. Our campaign sued the Secretary of State to make sure that the Chinese language translation of Prop 16 was accurate. We prevailed in that lawsuit. So there are many, many things that we can do because we want to model the way inclusion and diversity ought to work. That being said, I think one of the things in the Chinese immigrant community in particular that we have to help explain is some of the history of affirmative action, some of the history of civil rights. All of us want to believe in this notion of that we can just walk into a free and equal society, but that's not been the history of this country. We have to fight for it, right? And we have to fight for it with policies that are race conscious and are gender conscious. So we know that people of all backgrounds believe in opportunity for everyone. I don't think opportunity is zero sum. As a man, I don't feel better knowing that women are paid less. I don't see that as being zero sum in any way. I don't see it as zero sum to have teachers from just one background. I think I benefit from from having schools where there are teachers from all backgrounds, and for kids to be exposed to teachers from all backgrounds. I also think in higher ed settings, it benefits all students to be able to go to school with students from all backgrounds. So I think that, opportunity isn't zero sum. And I think this is part of what the opposition to affirmative action and civil rights and Prop 16 specifically try to put forward, that things have to be zero sum. In fact, when we work together on these things, we can do even more, including making sure that you see enrollment and campuses grow in number. Right? There's so many things. And so I think that what we are about is acknowledging that in our diversity, we can empathize with others, and that we can recognize that we each face different barriers, and we all benefit from removing barriers to opportunity that face any community.